So, the world's biggest economic powers, that's the G20, just met in South Africa, a first for the continent. And things got spicy right away because normally they would wait until the very end to release their big official statement. But this time, they rushed it out immediately. Now, the statement basically said climate change is a serious problem and poor countries need a break on their huge debts. This was a huge win for South Africa, which was trying to make sure global poverty and environmental issues were front and center. Now, the big drama, the US, under President Trump, totally snubbed the whole event because, they're currently fighting diplomatically with South Africa. Now, they were furious that the declaration even mentioned climate change, which Trump often calls fake. Now, the US accused South Africa of using the G20 to pick a fight and basically said, and I quote, "We'll fix this and put things back to normal when we take over the G20 leadership next year." It was a classic case of, the rest of the world moving forward on key issues, even when one major player decided to stay home and pout. All right, to discuss this, I'm joined by Professor Ntsikelelo Breakfast. He's a political analyst at Nelson Mandela University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Breakfast. So speak to us. South Africa broke tradition, that's G20 tradition, by pushing through the declaration on the opening day, declaring a victory, for consensus. Yet the U.S. called this an instrumentalization of the presidency. What are your thoughts? Do you think that the G20, in securing a strong political statement, sacrificed true multilateral integrity? Do you think that is there a long-term damage for this division?
South Africa has pulled through a successful G20 summit under very difficult circumstances, given the fact that there is this bilateral tension between us and the US. But South Africa stood her ground and refused to be bullied by the US, despite the fact that the US is a superpower in the current international world order. But I think the concern is that even though the declaration has been issued by all the members of the G20, if America says that it is going to disregard the positions that have been taken, then it means that those commitments which were made will not be honored, because there's always been this gap between the commitments which are made by the leaders and the issue of implementation. So, I don't know, because the US is supposed to build upon what has been done in South Africa, so that the work of the G20 could be done.
Okay, but then, Professor Breakfast, how does this affect Washington's standing, as a global leader? Does the U.S. risk alienating the global South by walking away from critical discussions on climate finance and sovereign debt?
The U.S. has the biggest economy on a global scale, and it's quite sad that they did not send a delegation to South Africa to be part of the engagements. It really puts the African continent also, of course, it's about the global South, but the African continent in particular, on the back foot. Really, it's a matter of a concern, seriously, because America is supposed to be at the heart of the discourse on a transformation of multilateral institutions, issues of debt, issues of peace, security, sustainable development, climate change, digital transformation, and so on. So, to stay away from the platform of the G20 was really a blow.
Okay. Now, South Africa's foreign minister stated that the G20 must move on with or without the U.S. So would you say this is a strategic turning point for African diplomacy? Or does, South Africa risk, severe economic retaliation like we've seen, such as the trade penalties for challenging Washington so directly?
Of course not. I mean, South Africa was supported by other G20 members. I mean, there were about 18 members of the G20 that were hosted by South Africa. Only the US stayed away by herself. The US was not forced to stay away. They wanted South Africa to hand over the chairmanship to a junior official, and South Africa refused to do that because that has never happened. And I don't think that South Africa is at fault because of that. I think the US has really disrespected South Africa, disregarded protocol, and it has really not been fair to South Africa. But I think the work of the G20 has to carry on. It looks like this diplomatic tension between South Africa and the US is going to go on until the term of office of Donald Trump is over, because foreign policy has always been influenced by the personality of the head of state. And currently, the head of state of the US has issues with South Africa and has framed a discourse which does not exist, that there are political killings on white farmers, a propaganda which is flawed.
Well, Dr. Breakfast, you also did mention earlier, that the U.S. is the largest economy, and we know that the declaration reaffirmed the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal and also committed to a just energy transition. Now, without the U.S., which is a historic emitter and also a major financier, how much real-world capital can truly be mobilized without them?
It's going to be a challenge to honor those commitments that were made by world leaders without the US. I mean, I've explained why, because if you look at the world order, I don't want to be everywhere, but we have great powers, like China, Germany, India, and so on. But America still remains the superpower, and there's a difference between the great powers and the superpower. So if you remove her from the discourse of sustainable development, really, I think you won't make a substantive impact in terms of changing the way things are on a global scale.
All right. Now, the G20, South Africa prioritized harnessing critical minerals for African inclusive growth, right? But how can the G20 ensure that, global demand for these green transitions resources translates into true local development rather than, a new form of resource extraction on the continent?
Yes, that's a very good point, because the African continent has been on the back foot. First of all, Africa has minerals, as you indicated. It's the richest continent on a global scale, but paradoxically, it's also the poorest continent, because the resources of the African continent have been used by Western powers to enrich them and to feed into the economic growth and the GDPs of those countries, while Africans don't benefit from those natural resources. So this needs to change. African countries with minerals should not only export these minerals, they need to make sure that they also turn them from raw material into products, so that Africans themselves can benefit out of the natural resources that they have. So Africa can have a voice in the global economy.
Okay, now, Dr. Barfus, with the African Union now a full G20 member, right? How did its presence practically influence, the final language of the declaration? Speak to us on that.
Well, for the first time, I think the African agenda featured prominently in the discourse. That's why, for instance, there was a commitment on investment on the African continent. There were other decisions that were made. For instance, the philosophy of Ubuntu also was subsumed into the discourse of food security, and that has never happened before. So that was indeed a breath of fresh air to hear the African agenda featuring prominently. But like I said, I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Those commitments that we made about the African continent, they need to be honored so that we can see a change for the better for the African continent.
Speaking of changing for the better, the summit also highlighted the recommendation, for a permanent international panel on inequality. So how close is this idea to becoming reality?
So that line of argument, that central thesis was also advanced by the former director of the IMF, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who pitched a very interesting presentation to the world leaders of the G20 that Africa has been affected by market-friendly policies that do not lead to social and economic transformation. That was very much important because multilateral institutions have been used also to exact interests on the African states, while African states are battling with challenges of inequality, poverty, and underdevelopment. So it's important that African states are able to implement policies that will narrow down the gap between the haves and the have-nots, because we've seen many protests on the African continent, which have, even before I joined, we're talking about structural violence in Nigeria. So that is an issue of inequality, poverty, and so on. So that issue needs to be addressed in order for peace to be embedded on the continent.
Well, you talked about structural violence in Nigeria, but then the declaration called for peace in conflict zones also, including Ukraine, Palestine, and also Sudan. Now, given the diverse political alignments, within the G20, how meaningful is this broad statement? And does it risk exposing the hypocrisy of members, who are actively engaged in or funding these very conflicts?
Yes, you are raising a very important matter, because within BRICS, I like the point that you made. There are also, I don't want to say factions, but groupings, because you have, the group of the BRICS, you have the G7, and so on. And of course, I agree with you. We have seen democracies backsliding on a large scale, across the globe. You have leaders who say this in public, but in private they do the exact opposite. So that has been a challenge, and it's a paradox. Hence, we've seen the rise of right-wing movements, even in the so-called matured democracies. So it's something that needs to be looked at. That the commitments that leaders make on platforms of that magnitude, they're able to honor them back home in their own backyard.
So now, beyond the U.S., Argentina also reportedly withheld its full endorsement. So to what extent is the G20 suffering from deeper internal fractures, with all of these, where the group's ability to act is now dependent on which political parties happen to be in power in a handful, of key nations? Because you did talk about, even some of these nations have their own, coalition, the G7 and all that.
I think the issue of Argentina was a very interesting turn of events. I guess he who pays the piper calls the tune. America has a very strong bilateral relationship with the current government of Argentina. I think they are the only country that raised a serious a concern about the absence of the U.S. Because of the relationship that they have with the U.S. But besides, I don't think though that poses a serious threat to the collective position that was taken by other dignitaries. But it really should not have happened though. But of course, states are sovereign. They have a right to be vehemently opposed to any issue that they are discontent about.
All right. So let's have your final thoughts, Professor Breakfast, on all of this.
Well, as I indicated, the most important thing is the implementation of that declaration. And I hope that, some of the leaders of the global north will untwist their ally, the US, to have a change of heart and not reduce the summit into South Africa, but look at the bigger picture, because there is a need to really address the problems of the current world order of inequality, poverty, climate change, digital transformation, and so on. And this, I think, it requires a collective effort. So America needs to look beyond South Africa.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ntsikelelo Breakfast, political analyst, Nelson Mandela University, Johannesburg, South Africa, for your time and your thoughts.